Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Knight. Chapter 30. The Cell. The cell in which Maslova was imprisoned was a large room, 21 feet long and 10 feet broad. It had 2 windows and a large stove. 2/3 of the space were taken up by shelves used as beds. The planks they were made of had warped and shrunk. Opposite the door hung a dark-coloured icon with a wax candle sticking to it and a bunch of everlastings hanging down from it. By the door to the right there was a dark spot on the floor, on which stood a stinking tub. The inspection had taken place and the women were locked up for the night. The occupants of this room were 15 persons, including 3 children. It was still quite light. Only 2 of the women were lying down. A consumptive woman imprisoned for theft, and an idiot who spent most of her time in sleep and who was arrested because she had no passport. The consumptive woman was not asleep, but lay with wide open eyes, her cloak folded under her head, trying to keep back the phlegm that irritated her throat and not to cough. Some of the other women, most of whom had nothing on but coarse brown holland chemises, stood looking out of the window at the convicts down in the yard, and some sat sewing. Among the latter was the old woman, Korobleva, who had seen Maslova off in the morning. She was a tall, strong, gloomy-looking woman. Her fair hair, which had begun to turn grey on the temples, hung down in a short plait. She was sentenced to hard labour in Siberia because she had killed her husband with an axe for making up to their daughter. She was at the head of the women in the cell and found means of carrying on a trade in spirits with them. Besides her sat another woman sewing a coarse canvas sack. This was the wife of a railway watchman. There are small watchmen's cottages at distances of about 1 mile from each other along the Russian railways, and the watchmen, or their wives, have to meet every train. Imprisoned for 3 months because she did not come out with the flags to meet a train that was passing, and an accident had occurred. She was a short, snub-nosed woman with small black eyes, kind and talkative. The third of the women who were sewing was Theodosia, a quite young girl, white and rosy, very pretty, with bright child's eyes, and long fair plaits which she wore twisted round her head. She was in prison for attempting to poison her husband. She had done this immediately after her wedding. She had been given in marriage without her consent at the age of 16, because her husband would give her no peace. But in the 8 months during which she had been let out on bail, she had not only made it up with her husband, but come to love him, so that when her trial came they were at heart and soul to one another. Although her husband, her father-in-law, but especially her mother-in-law, who had grown very fond of her, did all they could to get her acquitted, she was sentenced to hard labour in Siberia. The kind, merry, ever-smiling Theodosia had a place next Maslova's on the shelf bed, and had grown so fond of her that she took it upon herself as a duty to attend and wait on her. 2 other women were sitting without any work at the other end of the shelf bedstead. One was a woman of about 40, with a pale, thin face, who once probably had been very handsome. She sat with her baby at her thin white breast. The crime she had committed was that when a recruit was, according to the peasants' view, unlawfully taken from their village, and the people stopped the police officer and took the recruit away from him, she, an aunt of the lad unlawfully taken, was the first to catch hold of the bridle of the horse on which he was being carried off. The other, who sat doing nothing, was a kindly grey-haired old woman, hunched back and with a flat bosom. She sat behind the stove on the bed-shelf, and pretended to catch a fat 4-year-old boy who ran backwards and forwards in front of her, laughing gaily. This boy had only a little shirt on, and his hair was cut short. As he ran past the old woman, he kept repeating, "There! Haven't caught me!" This old woman and her son were accused of incendiarism. She bore her imprisonment with perfect cheerfulness, but was concerned about her son, and chiefly about her old man, who she feared would get into a terrible state with no one to wash for him. Besides these 7 women, there were 4 standing at one of the open windows, holding on to the iron bars. They were making signs and shouting to the convicts whom Maslova had met when returning to prison, and who were now passing through the yard. One of these women was big and heavy, with a flabby body, red hair, and freckled on her pale yellow face, her hands, and her fat neck. She shouted something in a loud, raucous voice and laughed hoarsely. This woman was serving her term for theft. Beside her stood an awkward, dark little woman, no bigger than a child of 10, with a long waist and very short legs, a red blotchy face, thick lips which did not hide her long teeth, and eyes too far apart. She broke by fits and starts into screeching laughter at what was going on in the yard. She was to be tried for stealing and incendiarism. They called her Koroshavka. Behind her, in a very dirty grey chemise, stood a thin, miserable-looking pregnant woman, who was to be tried for concealment of theft. This woman stood silent, but kept smiling with pleasure and approval at what was going on below. With these stood a peasant woman of medium height, the mother of the boy who was playing with the old woman, and of a 7-year-old girl. They were in prison with her because she had no one to leave them with. She was serving her term of imprisonment for illicit sale of spirits. She stood a little further from the window knitting a stocking, and though she listened to the other prisoners' words, she shook her head disapprovingly, frowned, and closed her eyes. But her 7-year-old daughter stood in her little chemise, her flaxen hair done up in a little pigtail, her blue eyes fixed, and, holding the red-haired woman by the skirt, attentively listened to the words of abuse that the women and the convicts flung at each other, and repeated them softly, as if learning them by heart. The 12th prisoner, who paid no attention to what was going on, was a very tall, stately girl, the daughter of a deacon, who had drowned her baby in a well. She went about with bare feet, wearing only a dirty chemise. The thick, short plait of her fair hair had come undone, and hung down, dishevelled, and she paced up and down the free space of the cell, not looking at anyone, turning abruptly every time she came up to the wall. End of Book 1, Chapter 30 of Resurrection, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Knight. Chapter 31. The Prisoners. When the padlock rattled and the door opened to let Maslova into the cell, all turned towards her. Even the deacon's daughter stopped for a moment and looked at her with lifted brows, before resuming her steady striding up and down. Korableva stuck her needle into the brown sacking and looked questioningly at Maslova through her spectacles. "Eh, dearie me, so you have come back. And I felt sure they'd acquit you. So you've got it?" She took off her spectacles and put her work down beside her on the shelf bed. "And here have I and the old lady been saying, 'Why, it may well be they'll let her go free at once.' Why, it happens, ducky. They'll even give you a heap of money sometimes, that's sure." The watchman's wife began, in her singing voice, "Yes, we were wondering why she'd been so long. And now just see what it is. Well, our guessing was no use. The Lord willed otherwise," she went on in musical tones. "Is it possible? Have they sentenced you?" asked Theodosia with concern, looking at Maslova with her bright blue childlike eyes, and her merry young face changed as if she were going to cry. Maslova did not answer, but went to her place, the second from the end, and sat down beside Korableva. "Have you eaten anything?" said Theodosia, rising and coming up to Maslova. Maslova gave no reply, but putting the rolls on the bedstead, took off her dusty cloak, the kerchief off her curly black head, and began pulling off her shoes. The old woman who had been playing with the boy came up and stood in front of Maslova. She clicked with her tongue, shaking her head pityingly. The boy also came up with her, and, putting out his upper lip, stared with wide-open eyes at the roll Maslova had brought. When Maslova saw the sympathetic faces of her fellow prisoners, her lips trembled, and she felt inclined to cry. But she succeeded in restraining herself until the old woman and the boy came up. When she heard the kind, pitying clicking of the old woman's tongue, and met the boy's serious eyes turned from the roll to her face, she could bear it no longer. Her face quivered, and she burst into sobs. "Didn't I tell you to insist on having a proper advocate?" said Narrator. "Well, what is it? Exile?" Maslova could not answer, but took from inside the roll a box of cigarettes, on which was a picture of a lady with hair done up very high and dress cut low in front, and passed the box to Korableva. Korableva looked at it and shook her head, chiefly because she did not approve of Maslova's putting her money to such bad use. But still she took out a cigarette, lit it at the lamp, took a puff, and almost forced it into Maslova's hand. Maslova, still crying, began greedily to inhale the tobacco smoke. "Penal servitude," she muttered, blowing out the smoke and sobbing. "Don't they fear the Lord, the cursed soul-slayers?" muttered Korableva, sentencing the lass for nothing. At this moment the sound of loud, coarse laughter came from the women who were still at the window. The little girl also laughed, and her childish treble mixed with the hoarse and screeching laughter of the others. One of the convicts outside had done something that produced this effect on the onlookers. "Looks, see the shaved hound? What's he doing?" said the red-haired woman, her whole fat body shaking with laughter, and leaning against the grating she shouted meaningless, obscene words. "Ah, the fat fright's cackling," said Korableva, who disliked the red-haired woman. Then turning to Maslova again, she asked how many years. "4," said Maslova, and the tears ran down her cheeks in such profusion that one fell on the cigarette. Maslova crumpled it up angrily and took another. Though the watchman's wife did not smoke, she picked up the cigarette Maslova had thrown away and began straightening it out, talking unceasingly. "There now, ducky, so it's true," she said. "Truth's gone to the dogs, and they do what they please. And here we were guessing that you'd go free. Norableva says she'll go free. I say no, say I. No, dear, my heart tells me they'll give it her. And so it's turned out," she went on, evidently listening with pleasure to her own voice. The women who had been standing by the window now also came up to Maslova, the convicts who had amused them having gone away. The first to come up were the woman imprisoned for illicit trade in spirits and her little girl. "Why such a hard sentence?" asked the woman, sitting down by Maslova and knitting fast. "Why so hard? Because there's no money, that's why. Had there been money, and had a good lawyer that's up to their tricks been hired, they'd have acquitted her, no fear," said Korableva. "There's what's-his-name, that hairy one with the long nose. He'd bring you out clean from pitch, Mum, he would. Ah, if we'd only had him." "Him indeed," said Khoroshavka. "Why, he won't spit at you for less than 1,000 roubles." "Seems you've been born under an unlucky star," interrupted the old woman who was imprisoned for incendiarism. "Only think, to entice the lad's wife and lock him himself up to feed vermin, and me too, in my old days." She began to retell her story for the 100th time. If it isn't the beggar staff, it's the prison. Yes, the beggar staff and the prison don't wait for an invitation. Ah, it seems that's the way with all of them, said the spirit trader, and after looking at her little girl she put down her knitting, and drawing the child between her knees, began to search her head with deft fingers. Why do you sell spirits? She went on. Why? But what's one to feed the children on? These words brought back to Maslova's mind her craving for drink. A little vodka, she said to Korobleva, wiping the tears with her sleeve and sobbing less frequently. All right, fork out, said Korobleva. End of Book 1, Chapter 31 of Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud.
.org. Recording by David Cole. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 32. A Prison Quarrel. Maslova got the money, which she had hidden in a roll, and passed the coupon to Korobleva. Korobleva accepted it, though she could not read, trusting to Khoroshavka, who knew everything, and who said that the slip of paper was worth 2 roubles 50 kopecks, then climbed up to the ventilator, where she had hidden a small flask of vodka. Seeing this, the women whose places were further off went away. Meanwhile Maslova shook the dust out of her cloak and kerchief, got up on the bedstead, and began eating a roll. "I kept your tea for you," said Theodosia, getting down from the shelf a mug and a tin teapot wrapped in a rag, "but I am afraid it's quite cold." The liquid was quite cold and tasted more of tin than of tea, yet Maslova filled the mug and began drinking it with her roll. "Finashka, here you are," she said, breaking off a bit of the roll and giving it to the boy, who stood looking at her mouth. Meanwhile Korobleva handed the flask of vodka and a mug to Maslova, who offered some to her and to Khoroshavka. These prisoners were considered the aristocracy of the cell because they had some money and shared what they possessed with the others. In a few moments Maslova brightened up and related merrily what had happened at the court, and what struck her most, i.e., how all the men had followed her wherever she went. In the court they all looked at her, she said, and kept coming into the prisoner's room while she was there. One of the soldiers even says, "It's all to look at you that they come. One would come in, 'Where is such a paper?' or something. But I see it is not the paper he wants. He just devours me with his eyes," she said, shaking her head. "Regular artists." "Yes, that's so," said the watchman's wife, and ran on in her musical strain. "They're like flies after sugar." "And here too," Maslova interrupted her, "the same thing. They can do without anything else, but the likes of them will go without bread sooner than miss that. Hardly had they brought me back when in comes a gang from the railway. They pestered me so, I did not know how to rid myself of them. Thanks to the assistant, he turned them off. One bothered so, I hardly got away." "What's he like?" asked Khoroshavka. "Dark, with moustaches." "It must be him." "Him? Who?" "Why, Sheglov, him as has just gone by." "What's he, this Sheglov?" "What, she don't know Sheglov? Why, he ran twice from Siberia. Now they've got him, but he'll run away." "The warders themselves are afraid of him," said Khoroshavka, who managed to exchange notes with the male prisoners and knew all that went on in the prison. "He'll run away, that's flat." "If he does go away, you and I'll have to stay," said Korobleva, turning to Maslova. "But you'd better tell us now what the advocate says about petitioning. Now's the time to hand it in." Maslova answered that she knew nothing about it. At that moment the red-haired woman came up to the aristocracy with both freckled hands in her thick hair, scratching her head with her nails. "I'll tell you all about it, Katerina," she began. "First and foremost, you'll have to write down you're dissatisfied with the sentence, then give notice to the procureur." "What do you want here?" said Korableva angrily. "Smell the vodka, do you? Your chatter's not wanted. We know what to do without your advice. No one's speaking to you. What do you stick your nose in for? It's vodka you want. That's why you come wriggling yourself in here." "Well, offer her some," said Maslova, always ready to share anything she possessed with anybody. "I'll offer her something." "Come on then," said the red-haired one, advancing towards Korableva. "Ah, think I'm afraid of such as you? Convict fright. That's her as says it. Slut. I, a slut. Convict, murderess," screamed the red-haired one. "Go away, I tell you," said Korableva gloomily, but the red-haired one came nearer, and Korableva struck her in the chest. The red-haired woman seemed only to have waited for this, and with a sudden movement caught hold of Korableva's hair with one hand, and with the other struck her in the face. Korableva seized this hand, and Maslova and Koroshavka caught the red-haired woman by her arms, trying to pull her away, but she let go the old woman's hair with her hand, only to twist it around her fist. Korableva, with her hair bent to one side, was dealing out blows with one arm, and trying to catch the red-haired woman's hand with her teeth, while the rest of the women crowded round, screaming and trying to separate the fighters. Even the consumptive one came up and stood coughing and watching the fight. The children cried and huddled together. The noise brought the woman warder and a jailer. The fighting women were separated, and Korableva, taking out the bits of torn hair from her head, and the red-haired one, holding her torn chemise together over her yellow breast, began loudly to complain. "I know it's all the vodka. Wait a bit, I'll tell the inspector tomorrow. He'll give it you. Can't I smell it? Mind, get it all out of the way, or it will be the worse for you," said the warder. "We've no time to settle your disputes. Go to your places and be quiet." But quiet was not soon re-established. For a long time the women went on disputing and explaining to one another whose fault it all was. At last the warder and the jailer left the cell, the women grew quieter and began going to bed, and the old woman went to the icon and commenced praying. "The two jailbirds have met," the red-haired woman suddenly called out in a hoarse voice from the other end of the shelf beds, accompanying every word with frightfully vile abuse. "Mind you don't get it again," Korableva replied, also adding words of abuse, and both were quiet again. "Had I not been stopped I'd have pulled your damned eyes out," again began the red-haired one, and an answer of the same kind followed from Korableva. Then again a short interval and more abuse. But the intervals became longer and longer, as when a thundercloud is passing, and at last all was quiet. All were in bed, some began to snore, and only the old woman, who always prayed a long time, went on bowing before the icon, and the deacon's daughter, who had got up after the warder left, was pacing up and down the room again. Maslova kept thinking that she was now a convict condemned to hard labour, and had twice been reminded this, once by Botchkova and once by the red-haired woman, and she could not reconcile herself to the thought. Korableva, who lay next to her, turned over in her bed. "There now," said Maslova in a low voice. "Who would have thought it? See what others do and get nothing for it. Never mind, girl. People manage to live in Siberia. As for you, you'll not be lost there either," Korableva said, trying to comfort her. "I know I'll not be lost. Still it is hard. It's not such a fate I want. I, who am used to a comfortable life." "Ah, one can't go against God," said Korableva with a sigh. "One can't, my dear." "I know, granny. Still it's hard." They were silent for a while. "Did you hear that baggage?" whispered Korableva, drawing Maslova's attention to a strange sound proceeding from the other end of the room. That sound was the smothered sobbing of the red-haired woman. The red-haired woman was crying because she had been abused and had not got any of the vodka she wanted so badly. Also because she remembered how all her life she had been amused, mocked at, offended, beaten. Remembering this, she pitied herself, and thinking no one heard her, began crying as children cry, sniffling with her nose and swallowing the salt tears. "I'm sorry for her," said Maslova. "Of course one is sorry," said Korableva, "but she shouldn't come bothering." End of Book 1, Chapter 32. Read by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. LibriVox.org. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 33. The Leaven at Work. Nekhlyudov's domestic changes. The next morning Nekhlyudov awoke, conscious that something had happened to him, and even before he had remembered what it was, he knew it to be something important and good. Katusha! The trial! Yes, he must stop lying, and tell the whole truth. By a strange coincidence, on that very morning he received the long-expected letter from Mary Valitsievna, the wife of the Marechal de Noblesse, the very letter he particularly needed. She gave him full freedom, and wished him happiness in his intended marriage. Marriage, he repeated with irony. How far I am from all that at present. And he remembered the plans he had formed the day before, to tell the husband everything, to make a clean breast of it, and express his readiness to give him any kind of satisfaction. But this morning this did not seem so easy as the day before. And then also, why make a man unhappy by telling him what he does not know? Yes, if he came and asked, he would tell him all. But to go purposely and tell, no, that was unnecessary. And telling the whole truth to Missy seemed just as difficult this morning. Again, he could not begin to speak without offence. As in many worldly affairs, something had to remain unexpressed. Only one thing he decided on, i.e., not to visit there, and to tell the truth if asked. But in connection with Katusha, nothing was to remain unspoken. I shall go to the prison and shall tell her everything, and ask her to forgive me. And if need be, yes, if need be, I shall marry her, he thought. This idea, that he was ready to sacrifice all on moral grounds, and marry her, again made him feel very tender towards himself. Concerning money matters, he resolved this morning to arrange them in accordance with his conviction that the holding of landed property was unlawful. Yet if he should not be strong enough to give up everything, he would still do what he could, not deceiving himself or others. It was long since he had met the coming day with so much energy. When Agrafena Petrovna came in, he told her, with more firmness than he thought himself capable of, that he no longer needed this lodging nor her services. There had been a tacit understanding that he was keeping up so large and expensive an establishment because he was thinking of getting married. The giving up of the house had therefore a special meaning. Agrafena Petrovna looked at him in surprise. "I thank you very much, Agrafena Petrovna, for all your care for me. But I no longer require so large a house, nor so many servants. If you wish to help me, be so good as to settle about the things, put them away as it used to be done during Mamma's life, and when Natasha comes in, she will see to everything." Natasha was Nekhlyudov's sister. Agrafena Petrovna shook her head. "See about the things? Why, they'll be required again," she said. "No, they won't, Agrafena Petrovna. I assure you they won't be required," said Nekhlyudov, in answer to what the shaking of her head had expressed. "Please tell Korney also that I shall pay him 2 months' wages, but shall have no further need of him." "It is a pity, Dmitri Ivanovitch, that you should think of doing this," she said. "Well, supposing you go abroad, still you'll require a place of residence again." "You are mistaken in your thoughts, Agrafena Petrovna. I am not going abroad. If I go on a journey, it will be to quite a different place. He suddenly blushed very red. Yes, I must tell her, he thought. No hiding. Everybody must be told. A very strange and important thing happened to me yesterday. Do you remember my Aunt Mary Ivanovna's Katusha? Oh yes, why I taught her how to sew. Well, this Katusha was tried in the court and I was on the jury. Oh Lord, what a pity, cried Agrafena Petrovna. What was she being tried for? Murder, and it is I have done it all. Well, now this is very strange. How could you do it all? Yes, I am the cause of it all, and it is this that has altered all my plans. What difference can it make to you? This difference, that I, being the cause of her getting onto that path, must do all I can to help her. This is just according to your own good pleasure. You are not particularly in fault there. It happens to every one, and if one's reasonable, it all gets smoothed over and forgotten, she said, seriously and severely. Why should you place it to your account? There's no need. I have already heard before that she had strayed from the right path. Well, whose fault is it? Mine. That's why I want to put it right. It is hard to put right. That is my business. But if you are thinking about yourself, then I will tell you that, as Mamma expressed the wish. I am not thinking about myself. I have been so bountifully treated by the dear defunct that I desire nothing. Lysenka, her married niece, has been inviting me, and I shall go to her when I am not wanted any longer. Only it is a pity you should take this so to heart. It happens to everybody. Well, I do not think so, and I still beg that you will help me let this lodging and put away the things. And please do not be angry with me. I am very, very grateful to you for all you have done. And, strangely, from the moment Nekhlyudov realized that it was he who was so bad and disgusting to himself, others were no longer disgusting to him. On the contrary, he felt a kindly respect for Agrafena Petrovna and for Corney. He would have liked to go and confess to Corney also, but Corney's manner was so insinuatingly deferential that he had not the resolution to do it. On the way to the law courts, passing along the same streets with the same isvostchik as the day before, he was surprised at what a different being he felt himself to be. The marriage with Missy, which only yesterday seemed so probable, appeared quite impossible now. The day before he felt it was for him to choose, and had no doubts that she would be happy to marry him. Today he felt himself unworthy, not only of marrying, but even of being intimate with her. If she only knew what I am, nothing would induce her to receive me. And only yesterday I was finding fault with her because she flirted with N. Anyhow, even if she consented to marry me, could I be, I won't say happy, but at peace, knowing that the other was here in prison, and would today or tomorrow be taken to Siberia with a gang of other prisoners, while I accepted congratulations and made calls with my young wife, or while I count the votes at the meetings, for and against the motion brought forward by the Rural Inspection, etc., together with the Marechal de Noblesse, whom I abominably deceive, and afterwards make appointments with his wife, how abominable, or while I continue to work at my picture, which will certainly never get finished. Besides, I have no business to waste time on such things. I can do nothing of the kind now, he continued to himself, rejoicing at the change he felt within himself. The first thing now is to see the advocate and find out his decision, and then go and see her and tell her everything. And when he pictured to himself how he would see her and tell her all, confess his sin to her, and tell her that he would do all in his power to atone for his sin, he was touched at his own goodness, and the tears came to his eyes. End of Book 1, Chapter 33. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. LibriVox.org. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 34. The Absurdity of Law. Reflections of a Juryman. On coming into the law courts, Nekhlyudov met the usher of yesterday, who today seemed to him much to be pitied, in the corridor, and asked him where those prisoners who had been sentenced were kept, and to whom one had to apply for permission to visit them. The usher told him that the condemned prisoners were kept in different places, and that, until they received their sentence in its final form, the permission to visit them depended on the President. "I'll come and call you myself and take you to the President after the session. The President is not even here at present. After the session. And now, please come in. We are going to commence." Nekhlyudov thanked the usher for his kindness and went into the juryman's room. As he was approaching the room, the other jurymen were just leaving it to go into the court. The merchant had again partaken of a little refreshment, and was as merry as the day before, and greeted Nekhlyudov like an old friend. And today Peter Gerasimovitch did not arouse any unpleasant feelings in Nekhlyudov by his familiarity and his loud laughter. Nekhlyudov would have liked to tell all the jurymen about his relations to yesterday's prisoner. By rights, he thought, I ought to have got up yesterday during the trial and disclosed my guilt. He entered the court with the other jurymen and witnessed the same procedure as the day before. "The judges are coming," was again proclaimed, and again 3 men with embroidered collars ascended the platform, and there was the same settling of the jury on the high-backed chairs, the same gendarmes, the same portraits, the same priest, and Nekhlyudov felt that, though he knew what he ought to do, he could not interrupt all this solemnity. The preparations for the trials were just the same as the day before, excepting that the swearing in of the jury and the President's address to them were omitted. The case before the court this day was one of burglary. The prisoner, guarded by 2 gendarmes with naked swords, was a thin, narrow-chested lad of 20, with a bloodless, sallow face, dressed in a grey cloak. He sat alone in the prisoner's dock. This boy was accused of having, together with a companion, broken the lock of a shed and stolen several old mats valued at 3 roubles. The rouble is worth a little over 2 shillings and contains 100 kopecks, and 67 kopecks. According to the indictment, a policeman had stopped this boy as he was passing with his companion, who was carrying the mats on his shoulder. The boy and his companion confessed at once, and were both imprisoned. The boy's companion, a locksmith, died in prison, and so the boy was being tried alone. The old mats were lying on the table as the objects of material evidence. The business was conducted just in the same manner as the day before, with the whole armoury of evidence, proofs, witnesses, swearing in, questions, experts, and cross-examinations. In answer to every question put to him by the President, the prosecutor, or the advocate, the policeman, one of the witnesses, invariably ejected the words, "Just so," or "Can't tell." Yet in spite of his being stupefied and rendered a mere machine by military discipline, his reluctance to speak about the arrest of this prisoner was evident. Another witness, an old house proprietor and owner of the mats, evidently a rich old man, when asked whether the mats were his, reluctantly identified them as such. When the public prosecutor asked him what he meant to do with these mats, what use they were to him, he got angry and answered, "The devil take those mats, I don't want them at all. Had I known there would be all this bother about them, I should not have gone looking for them, but would rather have added a 10-rouble note or 2 to them, only not to be dragged here and pestered with questions. I have spent a lot on isvostchiks. Besides, I am not well. I have been suffering from rheumatism for the last 7 years." It was thus the witness spoke. The accused himself confessed everything, and looking around stupidly, like an animal that is caught, related how it had all happened. Still the public prosecutor, drawing up his shoulders as he had done the day before, asked subtle questions calculated to catch a cunning criminal. In his speech he proved that the theft had been committed from a dwelling place, and a lock had been broken, and that the boy therefore deserved a heavy punishment. The advocate appointed by the court proved that the theft was not committed from a dwelling place, and that, though the crime was a serious one, the prisoner was not so very dangerous to society as the prosecutor stated. The President assumed the role of absolute neutrality in the same way as he had done on the previous day, and impressed on the jury facts which they all knew and could not help knowing. Then came an interval, just as the day before, and they smoked, and again the usher called out, "The judges are coming," and in the same way the two gendarmes sat trying to keep awake and threatening the prisoner with their naked weapons. The proceedings showed that this boy was apprenticed by his father at a tobacco factory, where he remained 5 years. This year he had been discharged by the owner after a strike, and, having lost his place, had wandered about the town without any work, drinking all he possessed. In a traktir (cheap restaurant) he met another like himself, who had lost his place before the prisoner had, a locksmith by trade and a drunkard. One night those two, both drunk, broke the lock of a shed and took the first thing they happened to lay hands on. They confessed all and were put in prison, where the locksmith died while awaiting the trial. The boy was now being tried as a dangerous creature from whom society must be protected. Just as dangerous a creature as yesterday's culprit, thought Nekhlyudov, listening to all that was going on before him. They are dangerous, and we who judge them? I, a rake, an adulterer, a deceiver? We are not dangerous. But even supposing that this boy is the most dangerous of all that are here in this court, what should be done from a common-sense point of view when he has been caught? It is clear that he is not an exceptional evil-doer, but a most ordinary boy. Every one sees it, and that he has become what he is simply because he got into circumstances that create such characters, and therefore, to prevent such a boy from going wrong, the circumstances that create these unfortunate beings must be done away with. But what do? We seize one such lad who happens to get caught, knowing well that there are 1,000 like him whom we have not caught, and send him to prison, where idleness, or most wholesome, useless labour is forced on him, in company of others weakened and ensnared by the lives they have led, and then we send him, at the public expense, from the Moscow to the Irkutsk government, in company with the most depraved of men. But we do nothing to destroy the conditions in which people like these are produced. On the contrary, we support the establishments where they are formed. These establishments are well known: factories, mills, workshops, public houses, gin shops, brothels. And we do not destroy these places, but looking at them as necessary, we support and regulate them. We educate in this way not one, but millions of people, and then catch one of them, and imagine that we have done something, that we have guarded ourselves, and nothing more can be expected of us. Have we not sent him from the Moscow to the Irkutsk government? Thus thought Nekhlyudov with unusual clearness and vividness, sitting in his high-backed chair next to the colonel, and listening to the different intonations of the advocates', prosecutors', and president's voices, and looking at their self-confident gestures. And how much and what hard effect this pretence requires, continued Nekhlyudov in his mind, glancing round the enormous room, the portraits, lamps, armchairs, uniforms, the thick walls and large windows, and picturing to himself the tremendous size of the building, and the still more ponderous dimensions of the whole of this organization, with its army of officials, scribes, watchmen, messengers, not only in this place, but all over Russia, who receive wages for carrying on this comedy which no one needs. Supposing we spent 1/100th of these efforts helping these castaways, whom we now only regard as hands and bodies, required by us for our own peace and comfort. Had some one chanced to take pity on him, and given some help at the time when poverty made them send him to town, it might have been sufficient, Nekhlyudov thought, looking at the boy's piteous face. Or even later, when after 12 hours' work at the factory he was going to the public house, led away by his companions, had some one then come and said, "Don't go, Vanya, it is not right," he would not have gone, nor got into bad ways, and would not have done any wrong. But no one who would have taken pity on him came across this apprentice in the years he lived like a poor little animal in the town, and with his hair cut close so as not to breed vermin, and ran errands for the workmen. No, all he heard and saw from the older workmen and their companions, since he came to live in town, was that he who cheats, drinks, swears, and gives another a thrashing, who goes on the loose, is a fine fellow. Ill his constitution, undermined by unhealthy labour, drink, and debauchery, bewildered as in a dream, knocking aimlessly about town, he gets into some sort of a shed, and takes from there some old mats which nobody needs, and here we, all of us educated people, rich or comfortably off, meet together, dressed in good clothes and fine uniforms, in a splendid apartment, to mock this unfortunate brother of ours, whom we ourselves have ruined. Terrible! It is difficult to say whether the cruelty or the absurdity is greater, but the one and the other seem to reach their climax. Nekhlyudov thought all this, no longer listening to what was going on, and he was horror-struck by that which was being revealed to him. He could not understand why he had not been able to see all this before, and why others were unable to see it. End of Book 1, Chapter 34. .org. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 35. The Procureur. Nekhlyudov refuses to serve. During an interval, Nekhlyudov got up and went out into the corridor, with the intention of not returning to the court. Let them do what they liked with him. He could take no more part in this awful and horrid tomfoolery. Having inquired where the Procureur's cabinet was, he went straight to him. The attendant did not wish to let him in, saying that the Procureur was busy, but Nekhlyudov paid no heed and went to the door, where he was met by an official. He asked to be announced to the Procureur, saying he was on the jury and had a very important communication to make. His title and good clothes were of assistance to him. The official announced him to the Procureur, and Nekhlyudov was let in. The Procureur met him standing, evidently annoyed with the persistence with which Nekhlyudov demanded admittance. "What is it you want?" the Procureur asked severely. "I am on the jury. My name is Nekhlyudov, and it is absolutely necessary for me to see the prisoner Maslova," Nekhlyudov said, quickly and resolutely, blushing, and feeling that he was taking a step which would have a decisive influence on his life. The Procureur was a short, dark man with short, grizzly hair, quick, sparkling eyes, and a thick beard cut close on his projecting lower jaw. "Maslova? Yes, of course, I know. She was accused of poisoning," the Procureur said, quietly. "But why do you want to see her?" And then, as if wishing to tone down the question, he added, "I cannot give you the permission without knowing why you require it. I require it for a particularly important reason." "Yes?" said the Procureur, and lifting his eyes, looked attentively at Nekhlyudov. "Has her case been heard or not?" "She was tried yesterday and unjustly sentenced. She is innocent." "Yes, if she was sentenced only yesterday," went on the Procureur, paying no attention to Nekhlyudov's statement concerning Maslova's innocence, "she must still be in the preliminary detention prison until the sentence is delivered in its final form. Visiting is allowed there only on certain days. I should advise you to inquire there. But I must see her as soon as possible, Nekhlyudov said, his jaw trembling as he felt the decisive moment approaching. Why must you? Said the Procureur, lifting his brows with some agitation. Because I betrayed her and brought her to the condition which exposed her to this accusation. All the same, I cannot see what it has to do with visiting her. This, that whether I succeed or not in getting the sentence changed, I want to follow her and marry her, said Nekhlyudov, touched to tears by his own conduct, and at the same time pleased to see the effect he produced on the Procureur. Really, dear me, said the Procureur, this is certainly a very exceptional case. I believe you are a member of the Krasnoporsk Rural Administration, he asked, as if he remembered having heard before of this Nekhlyudov, who was now making so strange a declaration. I beg your pardon, but I do not think that has anything to do with my request, answered Nekhlyudov, flushing angrily. Certainly not, said the Procureur, with a scarcely perceptible smile, and not in the least abashed. Only your wish is so extraordinary and so out of the common. Well, but can I get the permission? The permission? Yes. I will give you an order of admittance directly. Take a seat. He went up to the table, sat down, and began to write. Please sit down. Nekhlyudov continued to stand. Having written an order of admittance and handed it to Nekhlyudov, the Procureur looked curiously at him. I must also state that I can no longer take part in the sessions. Then you will have to lay valid reasons before the court, as you of course know. My reasons are that I consider all judging not only useless, but immoral. Yes, said the Procureur, with the same scarcely perceptible smile, as if to show that this kind of declaration was well known to him, and belonged to the amusing sort. Yes, but you will certainly understand that I, as Procureur, could not agree with you on this point. Therefore, I should advise you to apply to the court, which will consider your declaration, and find it valid or not valid, and in the latter case will impose a fine. Apply, then, to the court. I have made my declaration, and I shall apply nowhere else, Nekhlyudov said angrily. Well, then, good afternoon, said the Procureur, bowing his head, evidently anxious to be rid of this strange visitor. Who was that you had there? Asked one of the members of the court as he entered, just after Nekhlyudov left the room. Nekhlyudov, you know, the same that used to make all sorts of strange statements at the Krasnoporsk rural meetings. Just fancy, he is on the jury, and among the prisoners there is a woman or girl sentenced to penal servitude, whom he says he betrayed, and now he wants to marry her. You don't mean to say so? That's what he told me, and in such a strange state of excitement. There is something abnormal in the young men of to-day. Oh, but he is not so very young. Yes, but how tiresome your famous Ivoshenka was. He carries the day by wearying one out. He talked and talked without end. Oh, that kind of people should be simply stopped, or they will become real obstructionists. End of Book 1, Chapter 35.
LibriVox.org. Recording by S. M. Hammond. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 36. Nekhlyudov endeavors to visit Maslova. From the Procureur, Nekhlyudov went straight to the preliminary detention prison. However, no Maslova was to be found there, and the inspector explained to Nekhlyudov that she would probably be in the old temporary prison. Nekhlyudov went there. Yes, Katerina Maslova was there. The distance between the two prisons was enormous, and Nekhlyudov only reached the old prison towards evening. He was going up to the door of the large, gloomy building, but the sentinel stopped him and rang. A warder came in answer to the bell. Nekhlyudov showed him his order of admittance, but the warder said he could not let him in without the inspector's permission. Nekhlyudov went to see the inspector. As he was going up the stairs, he heard distant sounds of some complicated bravura played on the piano. When a cross servant girl with a bandaged eye opened the door to him, those sounds seemed to escape from the room and to strike his car. It was a rhapsody of lists that everybody was tired of, splendidly played, but only to one point. When that point was reached, the same thing was repeated. Nekhlyudov asked the bandaged maid whether the inspector was in. She answered that he was not in. Will he return soon? The rhapsody again stopped and recommenced loudly and brilliantly, again up to the same charmed point. I will go and ask, and the servant went away. Tell him he is not in, and won't be today. He is out visiting. What do they come bothering for? Came the sound of a woman's voice from behind the door, and again the rhapsody rattled on and stopped, and the sound of a chair pushed back was heard. It was plain the irritated pianist meant to rebuke the tiresome visitor who had come at an untimely hour. Papa is not in, a pale girl with crimped hair said crossly, coming out into the anteroom, but seeing a young man in a good coat, she softened. Come in, please. What is it you want? I want to see a prisoner in this prison. A political one, I suppose. No, not a political one. I have a permission from the procurer. Well, I don't know, and Papa is out. But come in, please, she said again, or else speak to the assistant. He is in the office at present. Apply there. What is your name? I thank you, said Nekhlyudov without answering her question, and went out. The door was not yet closed after him when the same lively tones recommenced. In the courtyard Nekhlyudov met an officer with bristly moustaches and asked for the assistant inspector. It was the assistant himself. He looked at the order of admittance, but said that he could not decide to let him in with a pass for the preliminary prison. Besides, it was too late. Please to come again tomorrow. Tomorrow at 10 everybody is allowed to go in. Come then, and the inspector himself will be at home. Then you can have the interview either in the common room or, if the inspector allows it, in the office. And so Nekhlyudov did not succeed in getting an interview that day and returned home. As he went along the streets, excited at the idea of meeting her, he no longer thought about the law courts, but recalled his conversations with the procurer and the inspector's assistant. The fact that he had been seeking an interview with her, and had told the procurer, and had been in 2 prisons, so excited him that it was long before he could calm down. When he got home, he at once fetched out his diary, that had long remained untouched, read a few sentences out of it, and then wrote as follows. For 2 years I have not written anything in my diary, and thought I never should return to this childishness. Yet it is not childishness, but converse with my own self, with this real divine self which lives in every man. All this time that I slept there was no one for me to converse with. I was awakened by an extraordinary event on the 28th of April, in the law court, when I was on the jury. I saw her in the prisoner's dock, the Katusha betrayed by me, in a prisoner's cloak, condemned to penal servitude through a strange mistake, and my own fault. I have just been to the procurer's and to the prison, but I was not admitted. I have resolved to do all I can to see her, to confess to her, and to atone for my sin, even by a marriage. God help me. My soul is at peace, and I am full of joy. End of Book 1, Chapter 36. LibriVox.org. Recording by S.M. Hammond. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 37. Maslova recalls the past. That night, Maslova lay awake a long time with her eyes open looking at the door, in front of which the deacon's daughter kept passing. She was thinking that nothing would induce her to go to the island of Sakhalin and marry a convict, but would arrange matters somehow with one of the prison officials, the secretary, a warder, or even a warder's assistant. Aren't they all given that way? Only I must not get thin, or else I am lost. She thought of how the advocate had looked at her, and also the president, and of the men she met, and those who came in on purpose at the court. She recollected how her companion Bertha, who came to see her in prison, had told her about the student whom she had loved while she was with Kitaeva, and who had inquired about her, and pitied her very much. She recalled many to mind, only not Nekhlyudov. She never brought back to mind the days of her childhood and youth, and her love to Nekhlyudov. That would have been too painful. These memories lay untouched somewhere deep in her soul. She had forgotten him, and never recalled and never even dreamt of him. Today, in the court, she did not recognize him, not only because when she last saw him he was in uniform, without a beard, and had only a small mustache and thick curly, though short hair, and now was bald and bearded, but because she never thought about him. She had buried his memory on that terrible dark night when he, returning from the army, had passed by on the railway without stopping to call on his aunts. Katusha then knew her condition. Up to that night she did not consider the child that lay beneath her heart a burden, but on that night everything changed, and the child became nothing but a weight. His aunts had expected Nekhlyudov, had asked him to come and see them in passing, but he had telegraphed that he could not come, as he had to be in Petersburg at an appointed time. When Katusha heard this, she made up her mind to go to the station and see him. The train was to pass by at 2 o'clock in the night. Katusha, having helped the old ladies to bed, and persuaded a little girl, the cook's daughter, Mashka, to come with her, put on a pair of old boots, threw a shawl over her head, gathered up her dress, and ran to the station. It was a warm, rainy, and windy autumn night. The rain now pelted down in warm, heavy drops, now stopped again. It was too dark to see the path across the field, and in the wood it was pitch black, so that although Katusha knew the way well, she got off the path and got to the little station where the train stopped for 3 minutes, not before, as she had hoped, but after the second bell had been rung. Hurrying up the platform, Katusha saw him at once at the windows of a first-class carriage. 2 officers sat opposite each other on the velvet-covered seats, playing cards. This carriage was very brightly lit up. On the little table between the seats stood 2 thick, dripping candles. He sat in his close-fitting breeches on the arm of the seat, leaning against the back, and laughed. As soon as she recognized him, she knocked at the carriage window with her benumbed hand. But at that moment the last bell rang, and the train first gave a backward jerk, and then gradually the carriages began to move forward. One of the players rose with the cards in his hand and looked out. She knocked again and pressed her face to the window, but the carriage moved on, and she went alongside looking in. The officer tried to lower the window, but could not. Nekhlyudov pushed him aside and began lowering it himself. The train went faster, so that she had to walk quickly. The train went on still faster, and the window opened. The guard pushed her aside and jumped in. Katusha ran on along the wet boards of the platform, and when she came to the end she could hardly stop herself from falling as she ran down the steps of the platform. She was running by the side of the railway, though the first-class carriage had long passed her, and the second-class carriages were gliding by faster, and at last the third-class carriages still faster. But she ran on, and when the last carriage with the lamps at the back had gone by, she had already reached the tank which fed the engines, and was unsheltered from the wind which was blowing her shawl about and making her skirt cling round her legs. The shawl flew off her head, but still she ran on. "Katerina Mikhailovna, you've lost your shawl!" screamed the little girl, who was trying to keep up with her. Katusha stopped, threw back her head, and catching hold of it with both hands, sobbed aloud. "Gone!" she screamed. "He is sitting in a velvet armchair and joking and drinking in a brightly lit carriage, and I, out here in the mud, in the darkness, in the wind and the rain, am standing and weeping," she thought to herself, and sat down on the ground, sobbing so loud that the little girl got frightened and put her arms round her, wet as she was. "Come home, dear," she said. "When a train passes, then under a carriage, and there will be an end," Katusha was thinking, without heeding the girl. And she made up her mind to do it, when, as it always happens, when a moment of quiet follows great excitement, he, the child, his child, made himself known within her. Suddenly all that a moment before had been tormenting her, so that it had seemed impossible to live, all her bitterness towards him, and the wish to revenge herself, even by dying, passed away. She grew quieter, got up, put the shawl on her head, and went home. Wet, muddy, and quite exhausted, she returned, and from that day the change which brought her where she now was began to operate in her soul. Beginning from that dreadful night, she ceased believing in God and in goodness. She had herself believed in God, and believed that other people also believed in Him, but after that night she became convinced that no one believed, and that all that was said about God and His laws was deception and untruth. He whom she loved, and who had loved her, yes, she knew that, had thrown her away, had abused her love. Yet he was the best of all the people she knew. All the rest were still worse. All that afterwards happened to her strengthened her in this belief at every step. His aunts, the pious old ladies, turned her out when she could no longer serve them as she used to. And of all those she met, the women used her as a means of getting money. The men, from the old police officer down to the warders of the prison, looked at her as on an object for pleasure, and no one in the world cared for aught but pleasure. In this belief, the old author with whom she had come together in the second year of her life of independence had strengthened her. He had told her outright that it was this that constituted the happiness of life, and he called it poetical and aesthetic. Everybody lived for himself only, for his pleasure, and all the talk concerning God and righteousness was deception. And if sometimes doubts arose in her mind, and she wondered why everything was so ill arranged in the world that all hurt each other and made each other suffer, she thought it best not to dwell on it, and if she felt melancholy she could smoke, or better still, drink, and it would pass. End of Book 1, Chapter 37. .org. Recording by S.M. Hammond. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 38. Sunday in Prison, Preparing for Mass. On Sunday morning at 5 o'clock, when a whistle sounded in the corridor of the women's ward of the prison, Korableva, who was already awake, called Maslova. "Oh dear, life again," thought Maslova with horror, involuntarily breathing in the air that had become terribly noisome towards the morning. She wished to fall asleep again, to enter into the region of oblivion, but the habit of fear overcame sleepiness, and she sat up and looked round, drawing her feet under her. The women had all got up, only the elder children were still asleep. The spirit trader was carefully drawing a cloak from under the children so as not to wake them. The watchman's wife was hanging up the rags to dry that served the baby as swaddling clothes, while the baby was screaming desperately in Theodosia's arms, who was trying to quiet it. The consumptive woman was coughing with her hands pressed to her chest, while the blood rushed to her face, and she sighed loudly, almost screaming in the intervals of coughing. The fat, red-haired woman was lying on her back, with knees drawn up, and loudly relating a dream. The old woman accused of incendiarism was standing in front of the image, crossing herself and bowing, and repeating the same words over and over again. The deacon's daughter sat on the bedstead, looking before her with a dull, sleepy face. Khoroshavka was twisting her black, oily, coarse hair round her fingers. The sound of slipshod feet was heard in the passage, and the door opened to let in two convicts, dressed in jackets and grey trousers that did not reach to their ankles. With serious, cross faces they lifted the stinking tub and carried it out of the cell. The women went out to the taps in the corridor to wash. There the red-haired woman again began a quarrel with a woman from another cell. "Is it the solitary cell you want?" shouted an old jailer, slapping the red-haired woman on her bare, fat back, so that it sounded through the corridor. "You be quiet." "Lawks, the old one's playful," said the woman, taking his action for a caress. "Now then, be quick. Get ready for the Mass." Maslova had hardly time to do her hair and dress when the inspector came with his assistants. "Come out for inspection," cried a jailer. Some more prisoners came out of other cells and stood in 2 rows along the corridor. Each woman had to place her hand on the shoulder of the woman in front of her. They were all counted. After the inspection, the woman warder led the prisoners to church. Maslova and Theodosia were in the middle of a column of over 100 women who had come out of different cells. All were dressed in white skirts, white jackets, and wore white kerchiefs on their heads, except a few who had their own colored clothes on. These were wives who, with their children, were following their convict husbands to Siberia. The whole flight of stairs was filled by the procession. The patter of softly shod feet mingled with the voices, and now and then a laugh. When, turning on the landing, Maslova saw her enemy Bachkova in front and pointed out her angry face to Theodosia. At the bottom of the stairs the women stopped talking. Bowing and crossing themselves, they entered the empty church, which glistened with gilding. Crowding and pushing one another, they took their places on the right. After the women came the men condemned to banishment, those serving their term in the prison, and those exiled by their communes. And coughing loudly, they took their stand, crowding the left side and the middle of the church. On one side of the gallery above stood the men sentenced to penal servitude in Siberia, who had been led into the church before the others. Each of them had half his head shaved, and their presence was indicated by the clanking of the chains on their feet. On the other side of the gallery stood those in preliminary confinement without chains, their heads not shaved. The prison church had been rebuilt and ornamented by a rich merchant who spent several tens of thousands of rubles on it, and it glittered with gay colors and gold. For a time there was silence in the church, and only coughing, blowing of noses, the crying of babies, and now and then the rattling of chains was heard. But at last the convicts that stood in the middle moved, pressed against each other, leaving a passage in the center of the church, down which the prison inspector passed to take his place in front of everyone in the nave. End of Book 1, Chapter 38.
.org Read by Bob Neufeld. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 39. The Prison Church. Blind Leaders of the Blind. The service began. It consisted of the following. The priest, having dressed in a strange and very inconvenient garb made of gold cloth, cut and arranged little bits of bread on a saucer, and then put them into a cup with wine, repeating at the same time different names and prayers. Meanwhile the deacon first read Slavonic prayers, difficult to understand in themselves, and rendered still more incomprehensible by being read very fast, and then sang them, turn and turn about, with the convicts. The contents of the prayers were chiefly the desire for the welfare of the Emperor and his family. These petitions were repeated many times, separately and together with other prayers, the people kneeling. Besides this, several verses from the Acts of the Apostles were read by the deacon in a peculiarly strained voice, which made it impossible to understand what he read. And then the priest read, very distinctly, a part of the Gospel according to St. Mark, in which it is said that Christ, having risen from the dead before flying up to heaven to sit down at his Father's right hand, first showed himself to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 devils, and then to 11 of his disciples, and ordered them to preach the Gospel to the whole creation. And the priest added that if anyone did not believe this, he would perish, but he that believed it, and was baptized, should be saved, and should, besides, drive out devils, and cure people by laying his hands on them, should talk in strange tongues, should take up serpents, and if he drank poison should not die, but remain well. The essence of the service consisted in the supposition that the bits cut up by the priest and put by him into the wine, when manipulated and prayed over in a certain way, turned into the flesh and blood of God. These manipulations consisted in the priest's regularly lifting and holding up his arms, though hampered by the gold cloth sack that he had on, then sinking on to his knees, and kissing the table and all that was on it, but chiefly in his taking a cloth by 2 of its corners, and waving it regularly and softly over the silver saucer and golden cup. It was supposed that at this point the bread and the wine turned into flesh and blood. Therefore this part of the service was performed with the greatest solemnity. "Now to the blessed, most pure, and most holy Mother of God," the priest cried from the golden partition which divided part of the church from the rest. And the choir began solemnly to sing that it was very right to glorify the Virgin Mary, who had borne Christ without losing her virginity, and was therefore worthy of greater honor than some kind of cherubim, and greater glory than some kind of seraphim. After this the transformation was considered accomplished, and the priest, having taken the napkin off the saucer, cut the middle bit of bread in 4, and put it into the wine, and then into his mouth. He was supposed to have eaten a bit of God's flesh, and swallowed a little of his blood. Then the priest drew a curtain, opened the middle door in the partition, and taking the gold cup in his hands, came out of the door, inviting those who wished to do so also to come and eat some of God's flesh and blood that was contained in the cup. A few children appeared to wish to do so. After having asked the children their names, the priest carefully took out of the cup with a spoon and shoved a bit of bread soaked in wine deep into the mouth of each child in turn, and the deacon, while wiping the children's mouths, sang in a merry voice that the children were eating the flesh and drinking the blood of God. After this, the priest carried the cup back behind the partition, and there drank all the remaining blood and ate up all the bits of flesh, and after having carefully sucked his moustache and wiped his mouth, he stepped briskly from behind the partition, the soles of his calfskin boots creaking. The principal part of this Christian service was now finished. But the priest, wishing to comfort the unfortunate prisoners, added to the ordinary service another. This consisted of his going up to the gilt, hammered-out image, with black face and hands, supposed to represent the very God he had been eating, illuminated by a dozen wax candles, and proceeding in a strange, discordant voice to hum or sing the following words: Jesus sweetest, glorified of the apostles, Jesu lauded by the martyrs, Almighty monarch, save me, Jesu my Saviour. Jesu, most beautiful, have mercy on him who cries to thee. Saviour, Jesu, born of prayer, Jesu, all thy saints, all thy prophets, save and find them worthy of the joys of heaven. Jesu, lover of men. Then he stopped, drew breath, crossed himself, bowed to the ground, and every one did the same, the inspector, the warders, the prisoners. And from above the clinking of the chains sounded more unintermittently. Then he continued: Of angels the Creator and Lord of powers, Jesu most wonderful, the angels' amazement, Jesu most powerful, of our forefathers the Redeemer, Jesu sweetest of patriarchs the praise, Jesu most glorious, of kings the strength, Jesu most good, of prophets the fulfilment, Jesu most amazing, of martyrs the strength, Jesu most humble, amongst the joy, Jesu most merciful, of priests the sweetness, Jesu most charitable, of the fasting the continence, Jesu most sweet, of the just the joy, Jesu most pure, of the celibates the chastity, Jesu before all ages of sinners the salvation, Jesu, Son of God, have mercy on me. Every time he repeated the word Jesu, his voice became more and more wheezy. At last he came to a stop, and holding up his silk-lined cassock, and kneeling down on one knee, he stooped down to the ground, and the choir began to sing, repeating the words, Jesu, Son of God, have mercy on me. And the convicts fell down and rose again, shaking back the hair that was left on their heads, and rattling with the chains that were bruising their thin ankles. This continued for a long time. First came the glorification, which ended with the words, Have mercy on me. Then more glorifications, ending with Alleluia. And the convicts made the sign of the cross and bowed, first at each sentence, then after every two, and then after every three. And all were very glad when the glorification ended, and the priest shut the book with a sigh of relief, and retired behind the partition. One last act remained. The priest took a large gilt cross, with enamel medallions at the ends, from a table, and came out into the centre of the church with it. First the inspector came up and kissed the cross, then the jailers, then the convicts, pushing and abusing each other in whispers. The priest, talking to the inspector, pushed the cross and his hand now against the mouths and now against the noses of the convicts, who were trying to kiss both the cross and the hand of the priest. And thus ended the Christian service intended for the comfort and the teaching of these strayed brothers. End of Book 1, Chapter 39. Visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Neufeld. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 40. The Husks of Religion. And none of those present, from the inspector down to Maslova, seemed conscious of the fact that this Jesus, whose name the priest repeated such a great number of times, and whom he praised with all these curious expressions, had forbidden the very things that were being done there; that he had prohibited not only this meaningless much-speaking and the blasphemous incantation over the bread and wine, but had also, in the clearest words, forbidden men to call other men their master, and to pray in temples, and had ordered that every one should pray in solitude, had forbidden to erect temples, saying that he had come to destroy them, and that one should worship not in a temple, but in spirit and in truth; and above all, that he had forbidden not only to judge, to imprison, to torment, and to execute men, as was being done here, but had prohibited any kind of violence, saying that he had come to give freedom to the captives. No one present seemed conscious that all that was going on here was the greatest blasphemy, and a supreme mockery of that same Christ in whose name it was being done. No one seemed to realize that the gilt cross with the enamel medallions at the ends, which the priest held out to the people to be kissed, was nothing but the emblem of that gallows on which Christ had been executed for denouncing just what was going on here; that these priests, who imagined they were eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ in the form of bread and wine, did in reality eat and drink his flesh and his blood, but not as wine and bits of bread, but by ensnaring these little ones with whom he identified himself, by depriving them of the greatest blessings, and submitting them to most cruel torments, and by hiding from men the tidings of great joy which he had brought. That thought did not enter into the mind of any one present. The priest did his part with a quiet conscience, because he was brought up from childhood to consider that the only true faith was the faith which had been held by all the holy men of olden times, and was still held by the Church and demanded by the state authorities. He did not believe that the bread turned into flesh, that it was useful for the soul to repeat so many words, or that he had actually swallowed a bit of God. No one could believe that, but he believed that one ought to hold this faith. What strengthened him most in this faith was the fact that for fulfilling the demands of his faith he had for the last 15 years been able to draw an income, which enabled him to keep his family, send his son to a gymnasium, and his daughter to a school for the daughters of the clergy. The deacon believed in the same manner, and even more firmly than the priest, for he had forgotten the substance of the dogmas of this faith, and knew only that the prayers for the dead, the masses, with or without the akathistus, all had a definite price, which real Christians readily paid, and therefore he called out his have mercy, very willingly, and read and said what was appointed, with the same quiet certainty of its being necessary to do so with which other men sell faggots, flour, or potatoes. The prison inspector and the warders, though they had never understood or gone into the meaning of these dogmas and of all that went on in the church, believed that they must believe, because the higher authorities and the Tsar himself believed in it. Besides, though faintly, and themselves unable to explain why, they felt that this faith defended their cruel occupations. If this faith did not exist, it would have been more difficult, perhaps impossible, for them to use all their powers to torment people, as they were now doing, with a quiet conscience. The inspector was such a kind-hearted man that he could not have lived as he was now living, unsupported by his faith. Therefore he stood motionless, bowed and crossed himself zealously, tried to feel touched when the song about the cherubims was being sung, and when the children received communion he lifted one of them and held him up to the priest with his own hands. The great majority of the prisoners believed that there lay a mystic power in these gilt images, these vestments, candles, cups, crosses, and this repetition of incomprehensible words, "Jesu sweetest, and have mercy," a power through which might be obtained much convenience in this and in the future life. Only a few clearly saw the deception that was practised on the people who adhered to this faith, and laughed at it in their hearts. But the majority, having made several attempts to get the conveniences they desired by means of prayers, masses, and candles, and not having got them, their prayers remaining unanswered, were each of them convinced that their want of success was accidental, and that this organization, approved by the educated and by archbishops, is very important and necessary, if not for this, at any rate for the next life. Maslova also believed in this way. She felt, like the rest, a mixed sensation of piety and dullness. She stood at first in a crowd behind a railing, so that she could see no one but her companions. But when those to receive communion moved on, she and Theodosia stepped to the front, and they saw the inspector, and behind him, standing among the wardens, a little peasant, with a very light beard and fair hair. This was Theodosia's husband, and he was gazing with fixed eyes at his wife. During the akathistus Maslova occupied herself in scrutinizing him and talking to Theodosia in whispers, and bowed and made the sign of the cross only when every one else did. End of Book 1, Chapter 40. LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Neufeld. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 41. Visiting Day. The Men's Ward. Nekhlyudov left home early. A peasant from the country was still driving along the side street and calling out in a voice peculiar to his trade, "Milk! Milk! Milk!" The first warm spring rain had fallen the day before, and now, wherever the ground was not paved, the grass shone green. The birch trees in the gardens looked as if they were strewn with green fluff. The wild cherry and the poplars unrolled their long, balmy buds, and in shops and in dwelling-houses the double window frames were being removed and the windows cleaned. In the Tolkuchi market, which Nekhlyudov had to pass on his way, a dense crowd was surging along the row of booths, and tattered men walked about selling top-boots, which they carried under their arms, and renovated trousers and waistcoats, which hung over their shoulders. Men in clean coats and shining boots, liberated from the factories, it being Sunday, and women with bright silk kerchiefs on their heads and cloth jackets trimmed with jet, were already thronging at the door of the traktir. Policemen with yellow cords to their uniforms and carrying pistols were on duty, looking out for some disorder which might distract the ennui that oppressed them. On the paths of the boulevards and on the newly revived grass, children and dogs ran about playing, and the nurses sat merrily chattering on the benches. Along the streets, still fresh and damp on the shady side, but dry in the middle, heavy carts rumbled unceasingly, cabs rattled, and tram-cars passed ringing by. The air vibrated with the pealing and clanging of church bells that were calling the people to attend a service like that which was now being conducted in the prison, and the people, dressed in their Sunday best, were passing on their way to their different parish churches. The isvostchik did not drive Nekhlyudov up to the prison itself, but to the last turning that led to the prison. Several persons, men and women, most of them carrying small bundles, stood at this turning, about 100 steps from the prison. To the right there were several low wooden buildings. To the left, a 2-storied house with a signboard. The huge brick building, the prison proper, was just in front, and the visitors were not allowed to come up to it. A sentinel was pacing up and down in front of it, and shouted at anyone who tried to pass him. At the gate of the wooden buildings to the right, opposite the sentinel, sat a warder on a bench, dressed in uniform with gold cords, a notebook in his hands. The visitors came up to him and named the persons they wanted to see, and he put the names down. Nekhlyudov also went up and named Katerina Maslova. The warder wrote down the name. "Why don't they admit us yet?" asked Nekhlyudov. "The service is going on. When the mass is over, you'll be admitted." Nekhlyudov stepped aside from the waiting crowd. A man in tattered clothes, crumpled hat, with bare feet and red stripes all over his face, detached himself from the crowd and turned towards the prison. "Now then, where are you going?" shouted the sentinel with the gun. "And you hold your row," answered the tramp, not in the least abashed by the sentinel's words, and turned back. "Well, if you'll not let me in, I'll wait. But no, must needs shout, as if he were a general." The crowd laughed approvingly. The visitors were, for the greater part, badly dressed people. Some were ragged, but there were also some respectable-looking men and women. Next to Nekhlyudov stood a clean-shaven, stout, and red-cheeked man, holding a bundle, apparently containing undergarments. This was the doorkeeper of a bank. He had come to see his brother, who was arrested for forgery. The good-natured fellow told Nekhlyudov the whole story of his life, and was going to question him in turn, when their attention was aroused by a student and a veiled lady, who drove up in a trap with rubber tires, drawn by a large thoroughbred horse. The student was holding a large bundle. He came up to Nekhlyudov and asked if and how he could give the rolls he had brought in alms to the prisoners. His fiancée wished it. This lady was his fiancée, and her parents had advised them to take some rolls to the prisoners. "I myself am here for the first time," said Nekhlyudov, "and don't know. But I think you had better ask this man." And he pointed to the warder with the gold cords and the book, sitting on the right. As they were speaking, the large iron door with a window in it opened, and an officer in uniform, followed by another warder, stepped out. The warder with the notebook proclaimed that the admittance of visitors would now commence. The sentinel stepped aside, and all the visitors rushed in the door as if afraid of being too late. Some even ran. At the door there stood a warder who counted the visitors as they came in, saying aloud, 16, 17, and so on. Another warder stood inside the building and also counted the visitors as they entered a second door, touching each one with his hand, so that when they went away again, not one visitor should be able to remain inside the prison, and not one prisoner might get out. The warder, without looking at whom he was touching, slapped Nekhlyudov on the back, and Nekhlyudov felt hurt by the touch of the warder's hand, but remembering what he had come about, he felt ashamed of feeling dissatisfied and taking offence. The first apartment behind the entrance doors was a large vaulted room with iron bars to the small windows. In this room, which was called the meeting room, Nekhlyudov was startled by the sight of a large picture of the crucifixion. "What's that for?" he thought, his mind involuntarily connecting the subject of the picture with liberation, and not with imprisonment. He went on, slowly letting the hurrying visitors pass before, and experiencing a mingled feeling of horror at the evil-doers locked up in this building, compassion for those who, like Katusha and the boy they tried the day before, must be here, though guiltless, and shyness and tender emotion at the thought of the interview before him. The warder at the other end of the meeting-room said something as they passed, but Nekhlyudov, absorbed by his own thoughts, paid no attention to him, and continued to follow the majority of the visitors, and so got into the men's part of the prison instead of the women's. Letting the hurrying visitors pass before him, he was the last to get into the interviewing room. As soon as Nekhlyudov opened the door of this room, he was struck by the deafening roar of 100 voices shouting at once, the reason of which he did not at once understand. But when he came nearer to the people, he saw that they were all pressing against a net that divided the room in two, like flies settling on sugar, and he understood what it meant. The two halves of the room, the windows of which were opposite the door he had come in by, were separated not by one, but by 2 nets reaching from the floor to the ceiling. The wire nets were stretched 7 feet apart, and soldiers were walking up and down the space between them. On the further side of the nets were the prisoners, on the nearer the visitors. Between them was a double row of nets and a space of 7 feet wide, so that they could not hand anything to one another, and any one whose sight was not very good could not even distinguish the face on the other side. It was also difficult to talk. One had to scream in order to be heard. On both sides were faces pressed close to the nets, faces of wives, husbands, fathers, mothers, children, trying to see each other's features and to say what was necessary in such a way as to be understood. But as each one tried to be heard by the one he was talking to, and his neighbor tried to do the same, they did their best to drown each other's voices, and that was the cause of the din and shouting which struck Nekhlyudov when he first came in. It was impossible to understand what was being said, and what were the relations between the different people. Next to Nekhlyudov, an old woman with a kerchief on her head stood trembling, her chin pressed close to the net, and shouting something to a young fellow, half of whose head was shaved, who listened attentively with raised brows. By the side of the old woman was a young man in a peasant's coat, who listened, shaking his head, to a boy very like himself. Next was a man in rags, who shouted, waving his arm and laughing. Next to him, a woman with a good woolen shawl on her shoulders sat on the floor, holding a baby in her lap and crying bitterly. This was apparently the first time she saw the grey-headed man on the other side, in prison clothes, and with his head shaved. Beyond her was the doorkeeper, who had spoken to Nekhlyudov outside. He was shouting with all his might to a grey-haired convict on the other side. When Nekhlyudov found that he would have to speak in similar conditions, a feeling of indignation against those who were able to make and enforce these conditions arose in him. He was surprised that, placed in such a dreadful position, no one seemed offended at this outrage on human feelings. The soldiers, the inspector, the prisoners themselves acted as if acknowledging all this to be necessary. Nekhlyudov remained in this room for about 5 minutes, feeling strangely depressed, conscious of how powerless he was, and at variance with all the world. He was seized with a curious moral sensation, like seasickness. End of Book 1, Chapter 41. Read by Bob Neufeld. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 42. Visiting Day. The Women's Ward. "Well, but I must do what I came here for," he said, trying to pick up courage. "What is to be done now?" He looked round for an official, and seeing a thin little man in the uniform of an officer going up and down behind the people, he approached him. "Can you tell me, sir," he said, with exceedingly strained politeness of manner, "where the women are kept, and where one is allowed to interview them?" "Is it the women's ward you want to go to?" "Yes, I should like to see one of the women prisoners," Nekhlyudov said, with the same strained politeness. "You should have said so when you were in the hall. Who is it, then, that you want to see?" "I want to see a prisoner called Katerina Maslova." "Is she a political one?" "No, she is simply—" "What? Is she sentenced?" Yes, the day before yesterday she was sentenced," meekly answered Nekhlyudov, fearing to spoil the inspector's good humour, which seemed to incline in his favour. "If you want to go to the women's ward, please to step this way," said the officer, having decided from Nekhlyudov's appearance that he was worthy of attention. "Siderov, conduct the gentleman to the women's ward," he said, turning to a moustached corporal with medals on his breast. "Yes, sir." At this moment heart-rending sobs were heard coming from some one near the net. Everything here seemed strange to Nekhlyudov, but strangest of all was that he should have to thank and feel obligation towards the inspector and the chief warders, the very men who were performing the cruel deeds that were done in this house. The corporal showed Nekhlyudov through the corridor, out of the men's into the women's interviewing room. This room, like that of the men, was divided by two wire nets, but it was much smaller, and there were fewer visitors and fewer prisoners, so that there was less shouting than in the men's room. Yet the same thing was going on here, only between the nets, instead of soldiers, there was a woman warder, dressed in a blue-edged uniform jacket, with gold cords on the sleeves and a blue belt. Here also, as in the men's room, the people were pressing close to the wire netting on both sides. On the nearer side the townspeople in varied attire, on the further side the prisoners, some in white prison clothes, others in their own coloured dresses. The whole length of the net was taken up by the people standing close to it. Some rose on tiptoe to be heard across the heads of others, some sat talking on the floor. The most remarkable of the prisoners, both by her piercing screams and her appearance, was a thin, dishevelled gypsy. Her kerchief had slipped off her curly hair, and she stood near a post in the middle of the prisoners' division, shouting something, accompanied by quick gestures, to a gypsy man in a blue coat, girdled tightly below the waist. Next to the gypsy man, a soldier sat on the ground talking to a prisoner. Next to the soldier, leaning close to the net, stood a young peasant, with a fair beard and a flushed face, keeping back his tears with difficulty. A pretty, fair-haired prisoner with bright blue eyes was speaking to him. These two were Theodosia and her husband. Next to them was a tramp, talking to a broad-faced woman, then two women, then a man, then again a woman, and in front of each a prisoner. Maslova was not among them, but some one stood by the window, behind the prisoners, and Nekhlyudov knew it was she. His heart began to beat faster, and his breath stopped. The decisive moment was approaching. He went up to the part of the net where he could see the prisoner, and recognized her at once. She stood behind the blue-eyed Theodosia and smiled, listening to what Theodosia was saying. She did not wear the prison cloak now, but a white dress, tightly drawn in at the waist by a belt, and very full in the bosom. From under her kerchief appeared the black ringlets of her fringe, just the same as in the court. "Now in a moment it will be decided," he thought. "How shall I call her? Or will she come herself?" She was expecting Bertha. That this man had come to see her never entered her head. "Whom do you want?" said the warder, who was walking between the nets, coming up to Nekhlyudov. "Katerina Maslova?" Nekhlyudov uttered with difficulty. "Katerina Maslova! Some one to see you!" cried the warder. End of Book 1, Chapter 42. Read by Bob Neufeld. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 1, Chapter 43. Nekhlyudov visits Maslova. Maslova looked round, and with head thrown back and expanded chest came up to the net with the expression of readiness which he well knew, pushed in between two prisoners, and gazed at Nekhlyudov with a surprised and questioning look. But concluding from his clothing he was a rich man, she smiled. "Is it me you want?" she asked, bringing her smiling face, with the slightly squinting eyes, nearer the net. "I I wish to see—" Nekhlyudov did not know how to address her. "I wish to see you. I—" Then he was not speaking louder than usual. "No nonsense, I tell you!" shouted the tramp, who stood next to him. "Have you taken it or not?" "Dying, I tell you. What more do you want?" Someone else was screaming at his other side. Maslova could not hear what Nekhlyudov was saying, but the expression of his face as he was speaking reminded her of him. She did not believe her own eyes. Still the smile vanished from her face, and a deep line of suffering appeared on her brow. "I cannot hear what you're saying," she called out, wrinkling her brow and frowning more and more. "I have come," said Nekhlyudov. "Yes, I am doing my duty. I am confessing." And at this thought the tears came in his eyes, and he felt a choking sensation in his throat, and holding on with both hands to the net, he made efforts to keep from bursting into tears. "I say, why do you shove yourself in where you're not wanted?" some one shouted at one side of him. "God is my witness, I know nothing!" screamed the prisoner from the other side. Noticing his excitement, Maslova recognized him. "You're like... But no, I don't know you!" she shouted, without looking at him, and blushing, while her face grew still more stern. "I have come to ask you to forgive me," he said, in a loud but monotonous voice, like a lesson learnt by heart. Having said these words, he became confused, but immediately came the thought that, if he felt ashamed, it was all the better. He had to bear this shame, and he continued in a loud voice, "Forgive me! I have wronged you terribly." She stood motionless, and without taking her squinting eyes off him. He could not continue to speak, and stepping away from the net, he tried to suppress the sobs that were choking him. The inspector, the same officer who had directed Nekhlyudov to the women's ward, and whose interest he seemed to have aroused, came into the room, and seeing Nekhlyudov at the net, asked him why he was not talking to her whom he wanted to see. Nekhlyudov blew his nose, gave himself a shake, and trying to appear calm, said, "It's so inconvenient through these nets. Nothing can be heard." Again the inspector considered for a moment. "Ah, well, she can be brought out here for a while. Mary Karlovna," turning to the warder, "lead Maslova out." A minute later Maslova came out of the side door. Stepping softly, she came up close to Nekhlyudov, stopped, and looked up at him from under her brows. Her black hair was arranged in ringlets over her forehead in the same way as it had been 2 days ago. Her face, though unhealthy and puffy, was attractive, and looked perfectly calm. Only the glittering black eyes glanced strangely from under the swollen lids. "You may talk here," said the inspector, and shrugging his shoulders, he stepped aside with a look of surprise. Nekhlyudov moved towards a seat by the wall. Maslova cast a questioning look at the inspector, and then, shrugging her shoulders in surprise, followed Nekhlyudov to the bench, and having arranged her skirt, sat down beside him. "I know it is hard for you to forgive me," he began, but stopped. His tears were choking him. "But though I can't undo the past, I shall now do what is in my power. Tell me, how have you managed to find me?" she said, without answering his question, neither looking away from him nor quite at him, with her squinting eyes. "Oh, God, help me! Teach me what to do," Nekhlyudov thought, looking at her changed face. "I was on the jury the day before yesterday," he said. "You did not recognize me?" "No, I did not." There was not time for recognitions. I did not even look," she said. "There was a child, was there not?" he asked. "Thank God he died at once," she answered, abruptly and viciously. "What do you mean? Why?" "I was so ill myself, I nearly died," she said, in the same quiet voice, which Nekhlyudov had not expected, and could not understand. "How could my aunts have let you go? Who keeps a servant that has a baby? They sent me off as soon as they noticed. But why speak of this? I remember nothing. That's all finished. No, it is not finished. I wish to redeem my sin." "There's nothing to redeem. What's been has been, and is past," she said. And what he never expected, she looked at him and smiled, in an unpleasantly luring, yet piteous manner. Maslova never expected to see him again, and certainly not here, and not now. Therefore, when she first recognized him, she could not keep back the memories which she never wished to revive. In the first moment she remembered dimly that new, wonderful world of feeling and of thought which had been opened to her by the charming young man who loved her and whom she loved. And then his incomprehensible cruelty, and the whole string of humiliations and suffering which flowed from and followed that magic joy. This gave her pain, and, unable to understand it, she did what she was always in the habit of doing. She got rid of these memories by enveloping them in the mist of a depraved life. In the first moment she associated the man now sitting beside her with the lad she had loved. But feeling that this gave her pain, she dissociated them again. Now this well-dressed, carefully got-up gentleman with perfumed beard was no longer the Nekhlyudov whom she had loved, but only one of the people who made use of creatures like herself when they needed them, and whom creatures like herself had to make use of in their turn as profitably as they could. And that is why she looked at him with a luring smile, and considered silently how she could make best use of him. "That's all at an end," she said. "Now I'm condemned to Siberia," and her lip trembled as she was saying this dreadful word. I was certain you were not guilty," said Nekhlyudov. "Guilty? Of course not. As if I could be a thief or a robber." She stopped, considering in what way she could best get something out of him. "They say that here all that depends on the advocate," she began. "A petition should be handed in. Only they say it's expensive." "Yes, most certainly," said Nekhlyudov. "I have already spoken to an advocate." "No money ought to be spared. It should be a good one," she said. "I shall do all that is possible." They were silent, and then she smiled again in the same way. "And I should like to ask you a little money, if you can. Not much, 10 roubles. I do not want more," she said, suddenly. Yes, yes," Nekhlyudov said, with a sense of confusion, and felt for his purse. She looked rapidly at the inspector, who was walking up and down the room. "Don't give it in front of him. He'd take it away." Nekhlyudov took out his purse as soon as the inspector had turned his back, but had no time to hand her the note before the inspector faced them again, so he crushed it up in his hand. "This woman is dead," Nekhlyudov thought, looking at this once sweet, and now defiled, puffy face, lit up by an evil glitter in the black, squinting eyes, which were now glancing at the hand in which he held the note, then following the inspector's movements, and for a moment he hesitated. The tempter that had been speaking to him in the night again raised its voice, trying to lead him out of the realm of his inner into the realm of his outer life, away from the question of what he should do to the question of what the consequences would be, and what would be practical. "You can do nothing with this woman," said the voice. "You will only tie a stone round your neck, which will help to drown you, and hinder you from being useful to others. Is it not better to give her all the money that is here, say good-bye, and finish with her forever?" whispered the voice. But here he felt that now, at this very moment, something most important was taking place in his soul, that his inner life was, as it were, wavering in the balance, so that the slightest effort would make it sink to this side or the other. And he made this effort by calling to his assistance that God whom he had felt in his soul the day before, and that God instantly responded. He resolved to tell her everything, now, at once. "Katusha, I have come to ask you to forgive me, and you have given me no answer. Have you forgiven me? Will you ever forgive me?" he asked. She did not listen to him, but looked at his hand and at the inspector, and when the latter turned, she hastily stretched out her hand, grasped the note, and hid it under her belt. "That's odd, what you were saying there," she said, with a smile of contempt, as it seemed to him. Nekhlyudov felt that there was in her soul one who was his enemy, and who was protecting her, such as she was now, and preventing him from getting at her heart. But, strange to say, this did not repel him, but drew him nearer to her by some fresh peculiar power. He knew that he must waken her soul, that this was terribly difficult, but the very difficulty attracted him. He now felt towards her as he had never felt towards her or any one else before. There was nothing personal in this feeling. He wanted nothing from her for himself, but only wished that she might not remain as she now was, that she might awaken and become again what she had been. "Katusha, why do you speak like that? I know you, I remember you, and the old days in Popovo." "What's the use of recalling what's past?" she remarked dryly. "I am recalling it in order to put it right, to atone for my sin, Katusha." And he was going to say that he would marry her, but, meeting her eyes, he read in them something so dreadful, so coarse, so repellent, that he could not go on. At this moment the visitors began to go. The inspector came up to Nekhlyudov and said that the time was up. "Good-bye. I still have much to say to you, but you see it is impossible to do so now," said Nekhlyudov, and held out his hand. "I shall come again." "I think you have said all." She took his hand, but did not press it. "No, I shall try to see you again, somewhere where we can talk, and then I shall tell you what I have to say, something very important." "Well, then, come. Why not?" she answered, and smiled with that habitual, inviting, and promising smile which she gave to the men whom she wished to please. "You are more than a sister to me," said Nekhlyudov. "That's odd," she said again, and went behind the grating. End of Book 1, Chapter 43.